Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine standing at the precipice of something immense, something both terrifying and profoundly beautiful. You're trying to understand the intricate threads that weave through life, death, and what truly makes it all meaningful. It's a quest that Paul Kalanithi, the extraordinary figure at the heart of our deep dive today, embarked on with a rare intensity. He lived it first as a brilliant, ascending neurosurgeon, then as a patient facing his own imminent mortality, ultimately becoming a powerful guide for all of us. Today, we're embarking on a profound exploration into that very intersection of medicine, mortality, identity, and the relentless human search for meaning. Our source material. The incredibly poignant, deeply personal memoir, When Breath Becomes Air by Paul Kalanithi. We're going to be diving deep into the poignant foreword written by the renowned author and physician Abraham Verghese, the heart-wrenching prologue that sets the stage for Paul's diagnosis, and part 1, which chronicles Paul's extraordinary, almost fated journey to becoming a neurosurgeon and the sudden, life-altering discovery of his illness. Our mission here for you is to extract the most vital, resonant insights from this deeply personal account. We want to give you a shortcut to understanding Kalanithi's unique perspective as both doctor and patient, offering you a rare glimpse into the human condition that few are privileged to share. And as we do, we hope to prompt you to consider these universal questions in your own life. This deep dive is all about gaining knowledge quickly but thoroughly, with plenty of aha moments waiting for you.
What's truly fascinating as we begin this deep dive is how we're introduced to Paul Kalanithi, not by his own voice initially, but through the words of Abraham Verghese in the foreword. It's an unconventional, almost paradoxical beginning, because Verghese confesses up front that he came to know Paul in the most intimate sense after Paul had already passed away. This temporal inversion, this act of meeting someone profoundly through their posthumous words, it sets a unique, almost spiritual tone for the entire book, hinting at the profound impact Paul's insights would have, transcending his physical presence.
That's such a striking detail, isn't it? It immediately tells you this isn't a typical memoir. Verghese describes a particularly memorable afternoon in early February 2014 when Paul came to see him at Stanford. Paul had just published that incredibly powerful, raw op-ed in the New York Times, How Long Have I Got Left? Verghese recalls how that essay, a public meditation on his terminal diagnosis, spread exponentially, eliciting an overwhelming outpouring from readers worldwide. In that moment, as the sun filtered through Magnolia Tree, casting dappled light, Verghese saw Paul seated before him, his beautiful surgeon's hands exceedingly still, his prophet's beard full, and those dark eyes intensely taking his measure. He remembers thinking, with a Vermeer-like quality to the scene, that he must remember this moment. It felt precious, something to be held on to. And perhaps most poignantly, in that quiet contemplation of Paul's profound vulnerability, Verghese became acutely aware of not just Paul's mortality, but the fragile, fleeting nature of his own. That's a connection that resonates deeply long after you read it.
It truly does. And this initial encounter with Verghese, even as it highlights Paul's later life, immediately brings into focus Kalanithi's dual passions, which were evident long before his diagnosis. Paul had a fascinating and deeply interdisciplinary academic background. He majored in both English and human biology as an undergraduate at Stanford, and then went on to pursue a master's in English literature. Verghese noted Paul's lifelong love of writing and reading, a foundational intellectual pursuit that initially seemed to steer him towards a career as an English professor, perhaps even a literary critic. However, as Verghese beautifully put it, just like his namesake, Paul felt the calling to become a physician. It wasn't a casual career pivot. It was a profound vocational pull, an irresistible force that drew him into the demanding world of medicine.
And that calling, that profound sense of purpose, it wasn't just about the science, was it? It wasn't merely about mastering complex surgical techniques or the intricacies of the human brain. Verghese, through his students who had been Paul's medical acolytes, observed Paul's fierce belief in the moral dimension of his job. This wasn't abstract. It meant that his interest in neurosurgery was profoundly driven by a love and empathy for those who suffered, for what they endured, and for what he might bring to bear to alleviate that suffering, not just physically but existentially. It was about forging deep human connection, even in the most sterile and demanding of clinical environments, seeing the person behind the pathology.
This deep connection to humanity, to the very essence of suffering and meaning, is intrinsically linked to the extraordinary power of Kalanithi's prose itself. Verghese described Paul's writing as simply stunning and unforgettable, going as far as to say, out of his pen he was spinning gold. He recognized a profound musicality to it, almost a prose poem, a rhythm that was both precise and deeply evocative.
What's really interesting here is the specific literary connections Verghese makes, which offer incredible insight into the intellectual lineage of Kalanithi's work. He noted echoes of Galway Kinnell's poetry, but most notably a prose style strikingly reminiscent of Thomas Browne's Religio Medici from 1642. Now, for many listeners, Thomas Browne is a very deep cut. His work is notoriously dense, a complex tapestry of scientific observation, religious contemplation, and profound self-reflection. Verghese himself admitted to a long struggle to understand Religio Medici, finding it opaque for decades despite his perseverance and deep literary background.
Yeah, he eventually discovered that the trick to understanding Browne's challenging cadence and intricate meaning was to read it aloud. This act of vocalizing the text allowed him to grasp its unique, almost tappable rhythm that is just off, as he described it. He suggests that we, the listeners and readers, do the same with Paul's book, particularly the final paragraph, to fully grasp that unique, almost musicality. And the relevance of Browne to Kalanithi is profound. Browne was a 17th century physician, a man of science and profound faith, who wrote Religio Medici as an introspective exploration of his own beliefs, grappling with the intersections of anatomy, philosophy, and spirituality in the face of human mortality. It was his personal testament, a doctor's struggle to find meaning in a complex world. For Verghese, Paul's work was Browne Redux, a timeless reflection of those same profound, universal questions about what it means to live, to suffer, and to die with dignity and purpose. Or, as he playfully suggests, Kalanithi Redux, implying that Browne was, in fact, mirroring Paul's timeless voice. It's head-spinning, as he says, but highlights the enduring, almost ancestral quality of Paul's insight, bridging centuries.
And what an extraordinary gift he left us, indeed. Verghese attended Paul's packed memorial at the Stanford Church, a gorgeous space where he often found renewal. Despite knowing Paul only briefly in life, a few fleeting encounters, he felt he was coming to know him in that packed church. It wasn't just through the eulogies, but through the moving and sometimes raucous stories shared by his diverse circle of friends, his pastor, his brother, and through the raw, visible grief of his wife, baby daughter, parents, and colleagues. Paul was palpably alive in those shared tears, those bursts of laughter, and the collective search for meaning in the face of such a profound loss.
But Verghese truly felt he came to know Paul most intimately, in the deepest sense of communion, only when he received the pages of When Breath Becomes Air 2 months after Paul died. He confessed to feeling an overwhelming sense of inadequacy after reading it, describing an honesty, a truth in the writing that took my breath away, leaving him breathless, almost undone. It was a raw, unvarnished truth, something rarely seen in such public accounts. He then gives us, the readers, a direct message, almost an exhortation, as if looking us in the eye. Be ready, be seated, see what courage sounds like, see how brave it is to reveal yourself in this way. But above all, see what it is to still live, to profoundly influence the lives of others after you're gone by your words. And his ultimate message, which resonates so deeply, is, in the silences between his words, listen to what you have to say back. It's not a passive reading experience, it's an invitation to a profound dialogue, to actively engage with the universal questions that Paul wrestled with, and to confront them within ourselves.
Here's where it gets really interesting and devastatingly poignant. We shift abruptly from the legacy of Paul's work, the profound impact of his words, to the very beginning of his end, the terrifying, life-altering moment his world utterly transformed. Paul Kalanithi, a neurosurgical chief resident, stands on the precipice of his final year of training, the culmination of decades of rigorous effort, flipping through CT scan images on a computer screen. He's done this thousands of times for his patients, routinely assessing their conditions, meticulously planning interventions, and delivering life-altering diagnoses with the calm authority of an expert.
But this particular set of images was horrifyingly different. The diagnosis to his trained eye was tragically, undeniably obvious, even before anyone uttered a word. The lungs were matted with innumerable tumors, the spine deformed, a full lobe of the liver obliterated, cancer widely disseminated. This wasn't a scan belonging to a stranger, a patient he could objectively treat. It was his own. The profound shift was immediate and visceral, a seismic rupture in his reality. Paul, typically dressed in a surgeon's scrubs and crisp white coat, commanding an operating room, found himself suddenly stripped of his identity, clad in a flimsy patient's gown, tethered to an office pole. He was staring at the hospital computer, using his medical expertise to examine his own devastating images, with his wife Lucy, an internist herself, standing silently, helplessly at his side. In that moment of utter disbelief, the trained physician in him tried to find an escape, a loophole. He pleaded, "Do you think there's any possibility that it's something else?" And the answer, stark, unyielding, and devoid of false hope, was simply, no. They held each other tightly. The undeniable truth of his mortality, shattering not just his future, but the life they had meticulously planned together.
And what makes this even more heart-wrenching is that it wasn't entirely out of the blue either, though Paul had, understandably, resisted the truth. He outlines the insidious, almost subtle, initial warning signs he'd been experiencing for about 6 months leading up to that moment. Unexplained weight loss and a ferocious back pain that gnawed at him. He recalls his belt cinching one, then 2 notches tighter, a silent alarm he tried to brush off, attributing it to the grueling, relentless demands of neurosurgical residency. When he finally forced himself to see a primary care doctor, a substitute for his usual classmate, he, the brilliant neurosurgeon, even attempted to medically diagnose himself with a less serious condition, like isthmic spondylolisthesis, consciously trying to avoid the obvious C word. He tried to subtly guide the doctor, who initially hesitated on ordering an MRI due to the prevalent emphasis on cost saving in the healthcare system, towards less definitive x-rays, clinging to any shred of an alternative explanation.
This internal struggle, this desperate attempt to outdiagnose his own terrifying reality, it's a powerful insight into the psychological impact of being on the other side of the medical divide. Paul, who just days earlier had been authoritative in a surgeon's coat, dispensing life and death decisions, became meek in a patient's gown, vulnerable and dependent. He knew more about spine disorders than his primary care doctor. Yet in that moment, he was desperate to believe the less likely, more benign diagnosis. He reasoned, almost pleading with himself, that the odds of cancer in the spine for someone in their 30s were 1 in 10,000, desperately clinging to any statistic that might offer an escape. It highlights the deeply human tendency to deny a terrifying reality, even when armed with an encyclopedic knowledge of medicine.
Those initial x-rays miraculously looked fine, which brought a temporary, fleeting sense of relief. He chalked the remaining symptoms up to the sheer exhaustion of hard work and the natural aging of his body, scheduling a follow-up for later, and plunged back into the grind. He was so close to the mountaintop of his career, on the very cusp of earning his neurosurgical attending position. He could almost taste the promised land, a life with less pressure, perhaps even sailing on a catamaran on the Mediterranean, the chronic tension in his back unwinding, finally becoming the attentive, present husband he'd promised Lucy he would be. But this brief reprieve was short-lived. Just a few weeks later, the symptoms worsened drastically, becoming impossible to ignore. Severe chest pain that felt like a vice, drenching night sweats that left him chilled, rapid, alarming weight loss, dropping from 175 to a gaunt 145 pounds, and a persistent hacking cough that he couldn't shake. There was little doubt left in his mind. The pivotal, silent reckoning came in Dolores Park in San Francisco when Lucy, always observant, caught a glimpse of his phone screen, which displayed medical database search results for frequency of cancers in 30 to 40-year-olds. She was utterly devastated, not just because she had been worried sick about him too, but because he hadn't confided in her. She felt they were connected halfway, a deep chasm opening between them, and he had promised her one life, only to give her another.
The book vividly and painfully explores the pressure cooker of their marriage, already strained to its limits by the immense, all-consuming demands of neurosurgical training. Lucy's raw honesty about feeling isolated, about feeling his distance and preoccupation, was crushing. Her crucial, piercing question, "Do you really think things will be better when you're an academic neurosurgery attending?" cut through his denial, forcing him to confront the notion that perhaps his singular pursuit of medicine was simply postponing their shared life, not making it possible. Paul, desperate to mend their fracturing connection, offered a flurry of concessions. He'd skip an upcoming trip, be more open, even see a couples therapist. But Lucy, overwhelmed and needing space, insisted she needed time alone. In that moment of profound vulnerability and the terrifying fear of abandonment, Paul made an internal, desperate decision. If he did in fact have cancer, he wouldn't tell her. He believed in a twisted act of perceived selflessness, that she'd then be free to live whatever life she chose, unburdened by his illness, spared the agony of watching him fade.
The unspoken words, the ones that held his terrifying secret, hung heavy in the air between them. Before leaving for a trip to New York, a whirlwind of professional engagements, Paul snuck in a few quick medical appointments to rule out common, less aggressive cancers, desperately trying to find any other explanation for his rapidly deteriorating body. He then plunged into a grueling 36-hour surgery marathon, operating with a quiet desperation, his back excruciatingly painful, a constant sharp reminder of the truth. On the train to Cold Spring, New York, the pain was so severe, so relentless, that he had to lie on a hard bench in the aisle, focusing intently, naming every muscle in his back, erector spinae, rhomboid, latissimus, piriformis, just to stave off the crushing waves of tears. He almost confessed to a kindly security guard who checked on him the words, "I'm sorry, but I'm dying from cancer," rising to his lips, but they died on his tongue. He wondered if it was just what people with back pain live with, clinging to the irrational fear that merely saying it aloud would jinx him, make it real. It wasn't until the third night of his trip, finally talking to his trusted friend Mike, that he managed to finally voice the unthinkable, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "Mike, I think I have cancer. And not the good kind either." It was the first time he had said it aloud, a terrible, liberating confession.
The confirmation, though already grimly anticipated by Paul, came swiftly and brutally. As he stepped off the plane in San Francisco, still reeling from the confession to Mike, his primary care doctor called with the chest X-ray result. His lungs, instead of being clear and healthy, looked blurry, as if the camera aperture had been left open too long, she said, her voice uncertain. The doctor claimed not to know what it meant, attempting a clinical detachment, but Paul knew with chilling certainty, and he suspected with an unnerving clarity that she likely knew too. Lucy picked him up from the airport, her face etched with worry. When he told her, sitting on the couch in their apartment, the words almost unnecessary, she knew. The emotional distance that had separated them for months vanished in an instant as they held each other, Lucy's embrace a lifeline. "I need you," he whispered, a rare admission of vulnerability. "I will never leave you," she vowed, her voice choked with emotion, a promise that would define their remaining time together. They called a close neurosurgeon friend who, understanding the gravity, admitted Paul to the hospital immediately.
And there he was, the world-class neurosurgeon suddenly reduced to a patient lying in the same room where I had seen hundreds of patients over the years. This was a room steeped in profound human drama, a space where he had delivered terminal diagnoses with gravity and compassion, explained complex, life-saving operations, congratulated patients on being cured, and, with quiet reverence, pronounced others dead. He had sat in the chairs, washed his hands in the sink, scrawled intricate instructions on the marker board. He had even, in moments of utter exhaustion during grueling shifts, longed to simply lie down in that very bed and sleep, just for a few hours of reprieve. Now he lay there, wide awake, lucid, a patient, experiencing the stark, terrifying reality of being on the other side of medicine, rather than its dispenser.
And with that stark realization, as a young, unfamiliar nurse announced, "The doctor will be in soon," the magnificent future Paul had imagined, the one just about to be realized, the culmination of decades of striving and sacrifice, simply evaporated. All the intricate plans he had made, all the promises he had whispered to Lucy about their life after residency, his expected career as a professor of neurosurgery, becoming a leading researcher, it all collapsed in an instant, like a house of cards. This was the profound sense of loss, not just of life itself, but of an entire identity, a meticulously built future, and a purpose that had defined his very being. The life he had planned was gone, replaced by a terrifying unknown void.
So what does this all mean for Paul? How did Paul Kalanithi, this brilliant neurosurgeon, arrive at that hospital bed staring at his own scans, his future evaporated? To truly grasp the magnitude of that moment, we must first understand the extraordinary journey that led him there. Ironically, Paul was initially certain he would never be a doctor. He felt medicine's presence in his early life only by its absence, specifically the profound, almost constant absence of his own father during his childhood. His father, a doctor himself, a chief of medicine, would leave before dawn and return after dark, leaving Paul to know him primarily through austere diktats and short, concentrated but sincere bursts of high-intensity fatherhood. If that was the price of medicine, Paul concluded, if it meant such detachment and lack of presence, it was simply too high.
This early disinterest in medicine, born from a childhood marked by a father's demanding career, is crucial for understanding his later fervent calling. A significant geographical and cultural shift played an enormous role in his formative years. When Paul was 10, his father relocated their family from affluent Bronxville, New York, a bastion of East Coast intellectualism, to Kingman, Arizona, a desert valley ringed by two mountain ranges, infamous even then as the least educated district in America with a staggering 30% high school dropout rate. It was a stark, almost brutal contrast to their previous life, and quite a profound culture shock for the young Paul and his brother.
It sounds like it was a world away, not just geographically, but culturally. Paul painted a vivid picture of that desert environment, recalling its unique freedoms and subtle terrors. He talks about their dogs bringing home gruesome bones, the constant vigilance for glistening black widow spiders with their dreaded red hourglasses hidden under rocks, and the local country facts he absorbed, like the mythical jackalope or the coyotes that supposedly lived inside cacti emerging for water. He even recounts a thrilling, slightly terrifying anecdote of him and his younger brother Jeevan spotting a 6-foot rattlesnake coiled menacingly on their doorstep, then with a mixture of fear and adrenaline, catching it and hurling it out into the desolate desert. This wild, unvarnished upbringing, so different from suburban New York, certainly shaped his perspective and instilled a unique blend of scientific curiosity and rugged self-reliance.
Indeed, the desert was formative, and its wildness instilled a certain grit. But it was Paul's mother who truly became the relentless catalyst for his intellectual journey, and ultimately his escape from Kingman's limitations. Despite her intractable mortal fear of snakes, a primal dread, her deeper, more profound fear was for her children's future in Kingman's impoverished and academically limited school system. She immediately recognized the stark disparity with her previous life in Westchester.
Her dedication was nothing short of extraordinary, almost a force of nature. She meticulously sourced a college prep reading list, an almost unheard of concept in Kingman, and incredibly made young Paul read George Orwell's 1984 at the tender age of 10. This, despite its scandalous sex for a child, indelibly instilled in him a deep love of and care for language. From there, she tirelessly introduced him to countless literary classics. The Count of Monte Cristo for its complex morality, Hamlet for its profound questions of human nature, and Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, which, as he noted, formed his nascent moral philosophy, leading him to argue even then that happiness was not the point of life. Beyond the book, she became a tireless activist, driving her children 100 miles to Las Vegas for ads, joining the local school board, and fiercely demanding that AP classes be introduced, effectively transforming the Kingman school system from within. She made it clear with every fiber of her being that the horizon for her children was what lay beyond those limiting desert mountains. Her activism bore fruit, inspiring his friend Leo, the salutatorian and poorest kid he knew, to get into Yale alongside Paul's own admission to Stanford.
His intellectual journey truly began to unfold with intensity at Stanford. Paul embarked on a deliberate quest to understand in earnest what makes human life meaningful. He pursued this profound question through the seemingly disparate fields of English literature and human biology, initially finding formal philosophy dry as a bone, too abstract for his pragmatic curiosity. He still felt literature provided the richest, most nuanced account of the life of the mind, the vast landscape of human experience, while neuroscience, with its elegant precision, laid down the most fundamental rules of the brain. He began to see meaning not as an abstract concept, but as inextricably linked to human relationships, moral values, and the very biological machinery that enabled them. He resonated deeply with T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland and its haunting themes of meaninglessness, fragmentation, and isolation in the modern world.
It was a pivotal, almost accidental moment in college, as he recounts, that truly shifted his focus and clarified his path. His older girlfriend Abigail gave him a lowbrow novel, Satan. His Psychotherapy and Cure, which, despite its title, contained a seemingly innocuous, throwaway assumption that the mind was simply the operation of the brain. This seemingly simple statement startled his naive understanding of the world, shaking the foundations of his dualistic view. He realized with a sudden, electrifying clarity that while literature provided a rich, profound account of human meaning, the brain was the machinery that somehow enabled it, the physical substrate for thought, emotion, and connection. It seems like magic, a profound mystery waiting to be unraveled, and that very night he opened his Stanford course catalog, grabbing a highlighter and marking biology and neuroscience classes alongside his literature choices, a new intellectual synthesis beginning to form.
This burgeoning realization sparked a profound internal conflict for Paul. Should he continue to pursue the scholarly study of human meaning, dissecting it intellectually, or should he actively engage in life, forging the very relationships that create meaning? He faced this choice heading into his sophomore summer, applying for 2 starkly different jobs. One was an intern at the highly scientific Yerkes Primate Research Center, where he would meticulously study macaques' rudimentary culture, analyzing observed behavior. The other was a prep chef at Sierra Camp, a rustic family vacation spot nestled in the mountains, promising quite simply the best summer of your life. He wrestled with the decision, the pragmatic scientist warring with the burgeoning humanist, ultimately choosing the camp. He decided to experience meaning, to live it, rather than just study it academically. His biology advisor, a staunch scientist, was furious, exclaiming, "Are you going to be a scientist or a chef?" The implication was clear, you couldn't be both.
But the camp, unexpectedly, delivered a lesson no academic institution could provide. He vividly described hiking Mount Talak at 2 a.m. under a full moon, the stark granite illuminated like silver, then watching the sunrise from nearly 10,000 feet up, the world unfolding beneath him. In that moment, he felt his speck-like existence against the immensity of the universe, yet simultaneously experienced a powerful reaffirming of your presence amid the grandeur. It was an experience of raw, transcendent beauty. He famously proclaimed, "No philosopher can explain the sublime better than this, standing between day and night." This direct, profound experience deeply affected him, teaching him that some truths are best understood not through intellectual dissection, but through lived experience.
Back on campus, Paul's quest for understanding continued, now enriched by this powerful experience of lived meaning. He deepened his studies in neuroscience, literature, and philosophy, driven by the desire to understand how the brain gives rise to an organism capable of finding meaning. He worked intensely in an fMRI lab, attempting to map the neural pathways of human experience. A particularly impactful visit occurred in one of his neuroscience classes, focused on neuroscience and ethics. They visited a home for people with severe brain injuries, where Paul encountered a young woman whose disconsolate wailing from her profound injuries filled the air. He was initially furious at the idea of parents abandoning such children, but then his professor delivered a chilling, pragmatic comment. "Sometimes, I think it's better if they die."
That must have been a profound shock, a jarring collision of youthful idealism and harsh reality.
It was. And only later, reflecting on that visit, did Paul fully realize that this trip added a critical new dimension to his understanding of the brain's centrality to identity. Brains give rise to our ability to form relationships and make life meaningful. Sometimes they break. This realization, combined with a growing sense of the academic limitations he felt in literary studies, solidified his path. For his master's thesis, he studied Walt Whitman's concept of the physiological spiritual man, exploring how the physical body and the soul were interwoven. But he concluded that traditional literary studies were becoming overly political and averse to science, too theoretical and detached from the tangible realities of life. His thesis advisor even remarked that most English PhDs reacted to science, like apes to fire, with sheer terror, highlighting the intellectual chasm he increasingly perceived.
And then, as if an internal fuse connected, came his true aha moment, a profound calling. Walking home from a football game one afternoon, amidst the cheers and the mundane, he heard a voice, not Augustine's ancient command to take up and read for divine revelation, but its profound opposite: set aside the books and practice medicine. Suddenly, the myriad threads of his intellectual journey seemed to weave together, and it all seemed utterly, undeniably obvious. Medicine, he realized, would allow him to find answers not in abstract theories or dusty tomes, but in the gritty, visceral reality of human suffering. He would seek a different sort of sublime, not in mountaintop sunrises, but in the intimate spaces of illness and death. He would forge profound relationships with the suffering, and most crucially, he would follow the question of meaning, even in the face of death and decay. He spent a pivotal year at Cambridge studying the history and philosophy of science and medicine, where he cemented his conviction that direct experience of life and death questions was essential for forming any substantial moral opinions. He wrote that words began to feel as weightless as the breath that carried them, their philosophical power diminished by the urgency of real-world suffering. And moral speculation, he concluded, felt puny compared to moral action. This direct engagement, this calling to action, was his path to Yale Medical School. You'd think the first time you cut into a dead human body in the stark, fluorescent light of a cadaver lab, it would be, well, utterly disturbing, maybe even traumatic. But Paul describes it with a strange, almost unsettling normalcy. The bright lights and stainless steel tables of the anatomy lab, he noted, lent an air of clinical propriety. Even so, that initial cut running the scalpel from the nape of the neck down to the small of the back was unforgettable. He describes how the scalpel didn't just cut, it unzipped it, revealing the hidden and forbidden sinew beneath, a violation of a primal taboo. His initial reaction was a bewildering mix of revulsion, exhilaration, nausea, frustration, and awe to the tedium. He called it teetering between pathos and bathos, the profound, sacred violation of a human body, yet simultaneously craving a burrito for lunch. Over time, the initial sacred violation became alarmingly routine, losing its awe, becoming simply the character of your average college class.
Paul reflects with piercing honesty on how cadaver dissection, this rite of passage, often epitomizes the rapid, sometimes unsettling transformation from a somber, respectful student into the callous, arrogant doctor. He recalls anatomy professors advising students to take one good, respectful look at the cadaver's face, then leave it covered throughout the dissection to make the work easier, to dehumanize the experience. He recounts a vivid, disturbing image of a senior surgeon, a mentor, casually leaning on a corpse's face, reconstructing the patient's history from the faint scars, while Paul, hacksaw in hand, thought chillingly of prosopagnosia, a neurological disorder where one loses the ability to recognize faces. He felt he'd soon acquire it too, an occupational hazard of the surgeon's detachment. The cadaver's humanity, however, still pops up in unexpected moments, like finding undigested morphine pills in his cadaver's stomach, a silent, poignant indication that the patient had died in pain alone. And the ethical question of informed consent lingered, especially when a son requested his half-dissected mother's body back. Despite her having donated it to science, her family's grief overriding her final wishes. It was a brutal lesson in the complexities of human suffering and legalities.
And it's not just the cadaver lab where doctors trespass. Paul eloquently makes the broader, crucial point that all of medicine, not just cadaver dissection, trespasses into sacred spheres. Doctors, by necessity, invade the body in every way imaginable, from inserting catheters to performing intricate surgeries. In doing so, they see patients at their most vulnerable, their most scared, their most private, exposed in ways no other profession demands. He notes the inherent uncomfortable paradox that lies at the heart of their work. Seeing the body as matter and mechanism is the flip side to easing the most profound human suffering. The very act of transforming a suffering human being into a collection of organs and systems, a mere pedagogical tool, is essential for treatment, but carries a profound psychological cost, blurring the lines of empathy.
His early experiences in clinical practice, moving from the cadaver lab to living patients, further sharpen this understanding of empathy and its challenges. He recounts an illuminating story about Lucy, his girlfriend and future wife, whom he met in medical school, and her innate capacity for empathy that profoundly impacted him. He recalls a night when she, while studying EKG's electrocardiograms, correctly identified a fatal arrhythmia on a practice EKG and immediately began to cry, tears streaming down her face. The squiggly lines on the page, representing a long-dead patient's heart, had transformed into a real human tragedy for her, a visceral connection that Paul, despite his intellectual curiosity, often struggled to achieve.
He also mentions Shep Newland's seminal book, How We Die, which he devoured in medical school, a book that unflinchingly confronted mortality. Newland's direct address of the reality of dying resonated deeply with Paul. He vividly recalls Newland's personal story as a young medical student alone in the operating room when his patient's heart suddenly stopped. In desperation, with no senior doctor present, Newland cut open the patient's chest and manually tried to pump his heart, becoming covered in blood and failure. While medical school training had evolved by Paul's time, making such a direct, desperate intervention unthinkable for a student, what remained constant, Paul realized, was that heroic spirit of responsibility amid blood and failure. This profound sense of duty, this willingness to grapple directly with death, even in its messiest forms, became for Paul the true image of a doctor.
Paul's first witnessed birth experience, a profound moment of creation, vividly twinned life and death for him, forcing him to confront their intimate, often brutal connection. He was in his obgyn rotation, working the graveyard shift in labor and delivery, an environment usually associated with joy. He describes the difficult case of Elena, a 22-and-a-half-week pregnant patient with twins, precariously balanced just on the cusp of viability at 24 weeks. There was no time to lose. They rushed to an emergency C-section. The attending physician quickly pulled out one, then two purple babies, barely moving, eyes fused shut, like tiny birds fallen too soon from a nest. They were too small to cradle, barely bigger than the surgeon's hands, and were immediately whisked away to the NICU, their chances of survival tragically slim.
He contrasted this wrenching experience with a normal birth he assisted with that same night, guiding a large, plump, and wet baby out into the world, feeling its weight and substance, its robust cries filling the room. He then delivered the happy news to the waiting, tearful family, a moment of pure, unadulterated joy. But the crushing news followed swiftly. Those fragile twins from the night before died. Baby A died that afternoon, and baby B not quite 24 hours later, around the time Paul was delivering the healthy baby. He could only think of Samuel Beckett's stark, poignant quote, "Birth astride of a grave, the light gleams an instant, then it's night once more." He questioned the agonizing judgment call involved in such situations. Which is worse, being born too early or waiting too long to deliver? It was a profound lesson that knowledge alone wasn't enough. Wisdom, a deeper understanding of human values, and the true cost of life was desperately needed when life and death hung in the balance.
This overwhelming realization that medicine demanded wisdom beyond mere knowledge deeply shaped his residency choices and professional philosophy. He observed many of his classmates, once filled with medical idealism, opting for lifestyle specialties like radiology or dermatology fields, with more humane hours, lower pressures, and less direct patient interaction, where the passionate idealism of their medical school applications seemed tempered or lost. He noted how some students even argued to remove language from their commencement oath that insisted on placing patient interests above our own, a chilling shift toward self-preservation. For Paul, this budding egotism was antithetical to medicine. He believed with unwavering conviction that medicine was a calling, a sacred vocation, not just a job to pay the bills.
And it was that profound sense of calling that drew him to neurosurgery, a decision cemented for him one night as he listened in awe to a pediatric neurosurgeon talking to the distraught parents of a child with a large, malignant brain tumor. The surgeon not only delivered the stark clinical facts with precision, but addressed the human facts as well, acknowledging the overwhelming tragedy and providing compassionate, practical guidance. This kind of illness, the surgeon told the parents, can either bring you together or it can tear you apart. Now more than ever, you have to be there for each other. For Paul, witnessing this profound engagement, neurosurgery became more than a specialty. It was the crucible of identity, where every operation on the brain is, by necessity, a manipulation of the substance of ourselves. He recognized that the question for a neurosurgeon was not simply whether a patient would live or die, but what kind of life is worth living. Would you trade your ability to speak for a few extra months of mute life? Or the function of your right hand to stop debilitating seizures? Neurosurgery, he concluded, demanded not just technical skill, but moral, emotional, mental, and physical excellence, what the ancient Greeks called arete, the highest ideal of human virtue and flourishing.
This rigorous pursuit of ariat came with a relentless, almost brutal toll. Paul describes the grueling schedules that defined residency, often working as much as 100 hours a week, often for 36 hours straight, enduring constant exhaustion that blurred the lines of reality. He notes that some residents simply couldn't stand the pressure, either unable to admit mistakes or leaving the demanding field entirely. Paul himself recalls making profound mistakes, like saving a patient's life but leaving them in a twilight existence of unconscious metabolism, a vegetative state which he viewed agonizingly as a more egregious failure than the patient dying. He realized with a heavy heart that the neurosurgeon must learn to adjudicate these impossible, agonizing choices, navigating a moral landscape where there were no easy answers.
Paul had initially been attracted to neurosurgery with an almost philosophical intent: to pursue death, to grasp it, uncloak it, and see it eye to eye, seeking a kind of transcendence by confronting mortality directly. He thought being so close to these life and death decisions would elevate his own being, grant him profound insight. But in the relentless grind of residency, he realized that being too close to the fiery light of suffering only blinded me to their nature. He became inured to suffering, a defense mechanism against the constant misery, adapting to the trauma by desensitizing himself. He even describes the dark humor he developed with his co-resident Jeff, a grim coping mechanism, using state population as our barometer for head injury severity. Is he a Wyoming or a California, they would ask, a chilling shorthand for the extent of brain damage. He recounts a particularly jarring anecdote. Eating an ice cream sandwich after a patient with severe head trauma died in the trauma bay. The sweet, cold dessert a stark contrast to the death around him, questioning if he had made more moral slides than strides in his quest for surgical excellence.
This creeping desensitization, this failed empathy, was further brought home by the devastating news of his medical school friend, Lori, who died after a car accident and emergency neurosurgery. The news opened a Pandora's box of medical images in his mind: the gurney, the blood, the tubes, the drill, the burning bone. And he felt an overwhelming, crushing guilt, a failed empathy for all the times he had pushed for discharge over patient worries or ignored their pain, consumed by the relentless demands of his training. He feared becoming Tolstoy's stereotype of a doctor, focused on rote treatment and physical symptoms, but utterly missing the larger human significance of suffering. He realized, with profound clarity that shook him to his core, nobody has it coming. His highest ideal, he concluded, became not just saving lives, since everyone dies eventually, but guiding a patient or family to an understanding of death or illness. He understood that when there's no place for the scalpel, words are the surgeon's only tool. He sought a pastoral role, a spiritual and emotional guide, helping patients and their families navigate the unchartable waters of mortality.
This new, profound focus transformed his practice, shifting from a purely technical approach to one deeply rooted in human connection. Informed consent, which was often a quick juridical exercise, a mere signature on a form, became for Paul an opportunity to forge a covenant with a suffering compatriot, a sacred agreement built on trust and shared understanding. He found inspiration in his own father's gentle bedside manner, recalling how his dad would use humor and compassion to bring comfort and levity to frightened patients. Paul describes a terrifying encounter with a 35-year-old brain tumor patient who was on the verge of refusing a life-saving surgery out of sheer terror. Instead of delivering a detached statistical spiel, Paul gathered her family around, sat down, and calmly talked through the options, meeting her in a space where she was a person instead of a problem to be solved. He acknowledged her fear, addressed her questions, and respected her autonomy. She chose surgery, and it went smoothly, a testament to the power of human connection in the medical encounter.
This commitment to the patient's full humanity, to seeing beyond the pathology, was especially crucial in neurosurgery because brain diseases carry an additional strangeness of the esoteric. They don't just affect a limb or an organ, they can alter the very essence of identity, making it feel like a star coming apart, as Kalanithi describes. He recalls vivid examples such as psychogenic syndromes, where traumatic news, like a devastating diagnosis, can literally cause the brain to suffer an electrical short, leading to terrifying symptoms like seizures or even a coma. He saw this happen to his own mother, who fell into a deep, unexplained coma after her father's death, and encountered a patient who fell into a similar coma upon hearing his brain cancer diagnosis. It powerfully underscores how deeply interwoven the physical brain is with one's consciousness, one's identity, and one's capacity for meaning, and how intimately it reacts to trauma.
He shares another deeply affecting case, that of Mrs. Lee, diagnosed with brain metastasis from lung cancer. He describes his gentle, deliberate approach to delivering such devastating news. He understood that a tureen of tragedy was best allotted by the spoonful. He carefully avoided detailed statistics like the Kaplan-Meier curve, which graphically depicts survival rates over time, arguing it's irresponsible to be more precise than you can be accurate, since you can't tell an individual patient precisely where they will sit on that cold, impersonal graph. Instead, he focused on clear, practical information and, crucially, holding a patient's hand, which in moments when patients were mute with shock became the mode of communication, a non-verbal gesture of shared humanity. He understood that openness to human relationality does not mean revealing grand truths. It means meeting patients where they are, in their fear, their denial, their hope, or their despair.
This profound connection, this shift towards a more humane and empathetic practice, came with a painful paradox. The relentless pursuit of surgical perfection amidst inevitable loss and the crushing reality of human fragility. Paul embarked on the neurosurgeon neuroscientist path, a dual role he deeply committed to, with his research focusing on neuromodulation, the cutting-edge ability to write signals into the brain to treat severe neurological and psychiatric diseases, offering hope for conditions like Parkinson's or even depression. He worked intensely in a Stanford lab with a mentor he admired immensely, V, whom he considered an actual paragon of goodness, scientific integrity, and surgical excellence.
Then, in a stunning and cruel reversal of roles, V was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, a particularly aggressive and often fatal disease. Paul, now in the doctor's role, but for his own beloved mentor, had to don his doctor hat and guide V through the terrifying labyrinth of diagnosis and treatment. In a moment of raw vulnerability, V, this moral exemplar, asked Paul, "Do you think my life has meaning? Did I make the right choices?" It was a profound, almost shattering moment for Paul, revealing that even the most virtuous, accomplished, and seemingly self-assured among us grapple with these fundamental existential questions when facing our own mortality. A year later, after a successful but grueling course of surgery, chemotherapy, and radiation, V, still frail but resilient, told Paul, "Today is the first day it all seems worth it. All the suffering seems worth it." This led Paul to a chilling yet deeply empathetic conclusion. How little do doctors understand the hells through which we put patients, an insight born not just from observation, but from witnessing profound suffering in someone he revered.
This understanding, this weight of medical responsibility, deepened as he returned to full-time clinical duties. He describes the relentless pace that defined his life. The days are long, but the years are short, a blur of intense concentration and exhaustion. Surgical skill wasn't just about technical precision, but speed, a tortoise and hare dynamic in the operating room. The funny thing, he noted, was the unique sense of timelessness within the OR. Intense, focused concentration made hours feel like minutes, suspension of reality. But outside the OR, the crushing weight of tasks, the bureaucratic demands, and the onerous yoke of mortal responsibility resumed its unrelenting grip. He recounts the devastating, indelible case of Matthew, the boy whose hypothalamus was slightly damaged in surgery years earlier. This minor, almost imperceptible surgical error had tragically transformed the adorable 8-year-old into a 12-year-old monster, aggressive and uncontrollable, eventually institutionalized a demon summoned by 1 millimeter of damage. It was a chilling testament to the brain's profound fragility and the devastating consequences of even the slightest error.
He also describes another deep brain stimulation case where a mere 2-millimeter difference in electrode placement caused the patient to feel overwhelmingly sad instead of controlling their tremors, a subtle shift with profound psychological impact. Another attending, a seasoned surgeon, confessed to Paul the agonizing memory of causing locked-in syndrome, a devastating condition where a patient is fully conscious but completely paralyzed with a 2-millimeter miscalculation. These stories illustrated the almost impossible precision required in neurosurgery, where even microscopic errors carried catastrophic consequences. He learned that sacrosanct regions of the brain, like the language areas, Wernicke's and Broca's, posed immense ethical dilemmas. What kind of life, he wondered, exists without language, without the ability to communicate? He met Mr. Michaels, a patient whose brain tumor had left him speaking only in streams of numbers, but still able to emote, to plead with his eyes and gestures. Paul realized there was a message he desperately wanted to convey to the world, but it remained tragically buried within his broken language centers. Even more astonishing was the patient who swore through awake brain surgery, profanity, apparently, runs on a different neural circuit than coherent speech.
Paul finally reached the pinnacle of residency. His surgical skills honed, mastering core operations, garnering top research awards, and securing a prestigious fellowship. He felt the individual strands of biology, morality, life, and death that he had wrestled with for so long were finally beginning to weave themselves into a coherent worldview, a grand tapestry of understanding. This immense power he now wielded, this capacity to intervene directly in the human brain, required a deep responsibility, a profound moral compass. But then, a phone call shattered his newfound coherence, his sense of mastery. His co-resident Victoria delivered the devastating news. Jeff, his friend and fellow resident, his confidant in the gallows humor of the trauma bay, had committed suicide after a difficult surgical complication and patient death. Paul was overwhelmed with gut-wrenching guilt, wishing he could have been walking with him out the door, wishing they could have commiserated, shared the unbearable burden that had crushed Jeff.
It's a stark reminder of the immense, almost unbearable burden they carried, the psychological cost of playing God, however reluctantly. He reflected on the unavoidable, universal truth that every doctor must eventually confront. Death comes for all of us. It is our fate as living, breathing, metabolizing organisms. But doctors like him and Jeff, unlike others, actively engage with death to grapple with it, assuming an onerous yoke of mortal responsibility. Their patients' lives and very identities are literally in their hands, yet death always wins. The final, hard-won lesson, forged in the crucible of his own near perfection and the tragic loss of a colleague, was profound. The secret is to know that the deck is stacked, that you will lose, that your hands or judgment will slip, and yet still struggle to win for your patients. You can't ever reach perfection, but you can believe in an asymptote toward which you are ceaselessly striving. This dedication to relentless excellence, this unwavering commitment even in the face of inevitable failure, came to define Paul, shaping him into the doctor he was meant to be. Now we bring it back to Paul, the brilliant neurosurgeon, now reduced to a patient, lying next to Lucy in that sterile hospital bed, the CT scan images of his riddled lungs still glowing with a terrifying clarity. The identity he had meticulously crafted and embodied, that of a skilled physician, a leader in his field, no longer mattered. He found himself the sheep, lost and confused, instead of the pastoral figure, the shepherd, guiding others through their illness. It was a complete disorienting reversal of roles.
He describes this shift not as merely life-altering, a simple change in circumstance, but as utterly life-shattering. It wasn't a moment of neat epiphany that suddenly illuminated what really matters, as spiritual narratives often suggest. Rather, he writes, it felt like someone had just firebombed the path forward, leaving behind only smoking ruins. His brother's well-meaning words offered his comfort. "You've accomplished so much," rang hollow and almost cruel, because all his future potential, his imagined life as a leading neurosurgeon, a researcher, a professor, would now go unrealized. He was physically debilitated. His identity collapsed, facing the same existential quandaries he had tirelessly helped his patients navigate. The future he had envisioned, built on decades of striving, was gone, replaced by what he described as a blank, a harsh, vacant, gleaming white desert, as if a sandstorm had erased all trace of familiarity.
In this desolate landscape, a truly compassionate and crucial figure enters his narrative. Dr. Emma Hayward, his oncologist. Paul knew Emma briefly from treating some of her patients, engaging in professional courtesies, but they had never truly spoken beyond that. Emma, a world-renowned expert in lung cancer, chose to meet him briefly that very night, despite it being late and her needing to leave to pick up her kids. This immediate, almost intuitive compassion, this prioritizing of the human connection, deeply impacted Paul, showing him she was different from the detached physicians he sometimes feared becoming.
What was particularly fascinating about Dr. Emma Hayward's approach is her immediate refusal to discuss Kaplan-Meier survival curves. Despite Paul, as a doctor steeped in data and statistics, insisting on his right to know the precise, cold percentages of his likely survival time. Her focus, refreshingly, was not on abstract numbers, but on Paul's quality of life and, crucially, preserving Paul's hands for surgery should his condition improve. She specifically recommended carboplatin over cisplatin in his chemotherapy regimen, knowing cisplatin was more likely to cause neuropathy and damage his precious surgical dexterity. Paul immediately felt a kinship with her plan A, B, and C approach to treatment, mirroring his own surgical mindset of anticipating contingencies. However, his internal conflict about the prognosis, the ground beneath his feet, still buckled and roiled, despite her compassionate guidance. He was still the doctor needing to know.
He experienced a profound, almost agonizing paradox in this new reality. His body and identity had radically changed almost overnight. He, the man who had wielded a scalpel with surgical precision, now needed a cane to walk. He, the relentless surgeon who endured 36-hour shifts, required a modified toilet seat. He found himself constantly wondering how, just 6 days prior to his diagnosis, he had spent nearly 36 straight hours in the operating room, performing intricate, life-saving procedures. He realized with a crushing clarity that without the duty to care for the ill pushing me forward, without that profound sense of purpose, he felt he became an invalid. It's a powerful statement about how purpose, responsibility, and the drive to help others can define one's very being and sense of self-worth.
In his new reality, stripped of his professional identity, Paul instinctively tried to read up on his condition, just as he would meticulously research a complex case for a patient. But he was utterly overwhelmed. The sheer volume of information, particularly about the latest chemotherapy regimens and new targeted therapies, was too vast, too complex, and too personal to allow for any useful objective study. He quotes the poet Alexander Pope, "A little learning is a dangerous thing. Drink deep, or taste not the Pierian spring." He found he couldn't place myself in this new world of information, couldn't find my spot on the Kaplan-Meier curve, that statistical graph showing probability of survival over time. It felt impersonal and yet devastatingly personal, simultaneously. He vividly illustrates the tragic irony as seen in an old photo of himself and Lucy from medical school, dancing and laughing. It was so sad, those two, planning a life together, unaware, never suspecting their own fragility. It was a cruel reminder of their youthful optimism, now shattered.
His family, in a whirlwind of loving but frantic activity, quickly worked to transition him from doctor to patient, setting up mail-order pharmacy accounts, ordering a bed rail, doing all the practical things that scream illness. His father, in a poignant display of denial, declared these modifications capitulations to the disease, insisting Paul would somehow be cured, that he would rally, that this couldn't possibly be the end. It was a denial Paul recognized immediately from the families of his own patients, the desperate clinging to hope in the face of overwhelming odds. He didn't know what to say to his father, just as he often hadn't known what to say to them in similar situations.
2 days later, Paul and Lucy met Emma Hayward in the clinic for a follow-up. Emma, compassionate yet firmly grounded in reality, reiterated her focus on preserving his quality of life and his hands for surgery. She offered tangible hope and practical steps for treatment, outlining a clear path forward, but still without providing precise statistics, sensing his need for a different kind of solace. Paul initially accepted her recommendation, allowing himself to believe that performing surgery again was a genuine possibility, a dream to hold on to. But that doctor's instinct, that insatiable desire for precise information, remained a deep, gnawing hunger within him. Despite Emma's resistance, despite her compassionate refusal to reduce his life to a number, he still had the Kaplan-Meier curve, that cold, hard statistical reality in the back of his mind. And so, in an act of quiet defiance and profound self-diagnosis, he made the internal decision to look up the Kaplan-Meier curves himself. The very knowledge he had once used to dispassionately guide patients through their prognosis was now something he desperately and tragically needed to understand for himself, to place himself, however painfully, on that cold statistical line, hashtag outro.
Paul Kalanithi's journey, as we've explored it today, is a profound and unvarnished account. From grappling with the abstract concept of death as a brilliant neurosurgeon to intimately facing it personally as a patient, his story illuminates the profound questions about meaning, identity, and raw courage that arise when life is suddenly put into its sharpest, most painful relief. The sources we've drawn from truly describe Kalanithi's unwavering dedication to excellence, his relentless pursuit of understanding, and his deeply human quest for meaning, even as his own body failed him.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Paul Kalanithi's story is a profound testament to finding purpose and forging meaning, even in the face of unimaginable suffering and loss. It raises an important question for all of us, for you, our listener. When faced with the most daunting challenges in your own life, when your path forward feels firebombed and uncertain, how do you define what makes life meaningful enough to go on living?
That's a question worth reflecting on, isn't it? Take a moment, perhaps after this deep dive, to truly consider what brings meaning and purpose to your own life, what guides you in the face of inevitable challenges.
Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to ReadersPair, where two readers bring you one book and endless insights. See you in the next chapter.